My baby dolls, we are back from summer break. New season of Genesis, second season on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, who is our industrious leader and producer of all our shows. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today, to start off the season, we are starting it off with a bang, and when I mean a bang, we're talking about the most storied rivalry in all of sports. We're talking about Yankees and Red Sox baseball, and we have a great book to talk about today with an author who really does research, and I have to admit, he's from the Midwest, but it impressed me with all of his research. The new book is called They Wore Red Sox and Pinstripes, and the author is Todd Stanley, and we'll get to Todd in a few minutes. But I love the color and the cover of this book. And, you have you got half of it's red and half of it's Yankees blue, and smack in the middle is the Babe himself, what he looked like on the Red Sox and what he looked like in probably the early Yankees. He was probably right after he was traded from the Red Sox. But we're going to cover the Babe. We're going to cover Jack Chesbro. We're going to go from the dead ball era. And we're going to go right to the present and see this storied rivalry. And, we're going to learn a lot of new things along the way, like I learned, friendly rivalry during the dead ball era. Quite a change, the curse of the Bambino. There was even talk of a swap for Ted Williams and Joe D in the mid-1940s, which would have been interesting. Ted Williams would have probably got his World Series ring on a Yankee team that was pretty much unstoppable in the late 40s, early 50s. But, of course, before we get there's a lot of great programming on the network. We got brand new shows. We got Bill Kashadis' Philadelphia Baseball, present, past, future, and that's a really, really exciting show. I love Bill. He was on the show a few months ago talking about the 93 Phillies. We got Nancy Finley, the niece of Charlie O, and those swinging A's doing Oakland A's baseball with the Zigzags man himself, and that's a great show. People should tune in. Alan Blumpkin, resident historian, and famous author Dave Nemec, in which I am the third wheel on their show, David Nemec's Baseball and Trivia. That's coming back. Dave's been settling in California. We have Mark Littell and Mark Weiss and their show, Mark in the Midday. And that is a great, great show because, Mark Littell is the guy who gave up the home run to Chris Chambliss in the 1976 ALCS, and he's just a wealth of knowledge, and he brings a lot to the network. Of course, you got Peter Golenbach in Golenbach University, Hal Bach. It also does a show on old-time sports. The network is growing. We're getting programming in to teach all you folks stuff that maybe you wouldn't be able to know about unless you actually come to the network, because the dead ball, the Negro League sites, women in baseball, stuff like this is unfortunately falling by the wayside. But thank God there's people like me who love this stuff, and I'm trying my darndest to teach about it. And we begin today with They Wore Red Sox and Pinstripes. And what's interesting? I didn't even know this. More than 300 ball players have spent the time between both the Red Sox and the Yankees. And this goes way back into when pretty much 1902, 1903. And a fascinating thing. You might ask, why would anyone trade within their division? It wasn't that way in the beginning, and we'll find that out. But who was Todd Stanley? Well, Todd Stanley is a junior high school social studies teacher in Central Ohio. Love social studies, was my favorite subject. He has written 11 books on education. He is a lifelong Cincinnati Reds fan and lives in Pinkerton, Ohio. And I always say, those who are educators, professors, anyone to deal with education, always writes good books. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Todd.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, it's fantastic. I was so looking forward to this because, as my listeners know, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, big Yankee fan. Never thought I'd be leaving New York. And here I am, 24 years in Massachusetts after I went to law school, still a Yankees fan when my kids, my family, and the whole Red Sox nation is against me. So this
you're
book,
in enemy territory.
Yeah, and you know something, Todd? Let me tell you something. The Yankees, I had no idea of the rivalry, and I'll tell you why. I lived in New York 23 years. I'm 47. So 23 years in New York I lived. I came to law school in 93, and I've been here 24 years. So my time in Massachusetts has eclipsed my time in New York City. I did not know of any curse of anything because the Yankees and Mets were always winning. And I didn't realize outside of this, the Red Sox were never a potential threat except for years, and that was that. And I think, the big thing was when I went down to Faneuil Hall in Boston, and I asked people, where were you when Bucky Dent hit that home run? They were ready to kill me. I think I realized then what the Red Sox mean to Red Sox Nation. Well, anyway, I digress. Why has this rivalry inspired you? A Midwesterner, of course, a Cincinnati Reds fan. Why aren't we having?
Sure.
Why aren't we talking about Cincinnati and the Los Angeles Dodgers, the lost, rivalry right there? Why are we talking Red Sox Yankees?
That is interesting because people often forget that the Dodgers and Reds were in the same division for many, many years. So what got me hooked on the Red Sox Yankees is the 2003 and 2004 World or playoffs. So the 2003 World playoffs when the Yankees and the Boston had that Game 7 and Aaron Boone hits a home run and so it was like watching a good television show. There was so much drama, there's so much story, there was so much, and I got really caught up in that. And so broke my heart when Aaron Boone hit that home run, and then in 2004 when they were at it again, it was just fascinating to watch that 2004 American League division series because it was remarkable. I mean, you couldn't write a script like they performed in that. The comeback, being down 3-0. The late inning wins, and it was just fascinating. So I got really caught up in that. And I've always been a fan of history of baseball. So it just led me to, a couple years later when Johnny Damon got traded to the Yankees, or not traded, I'm sorry, he went free agent. Well, because he said, I will never sign with the Yankees. And then 2 weeks later, he signed with the Yankees. And it got me thinking, how does someone who is in this storied rivalry, who just can't stand the Yankees because they were the idiots. He was the leader of the idiots, and they they were the anti-Yankees, and they were so against him. And all of a sudden, he becomes a Yankee, and he becomes cut. He doesn't have his long hair anymore. And so I was wondering what would that be like for someone to do that? And so I just was curious. So I started looking a little bit and researching a little bit, and I found that there was, I knew of some of the obvious ones like Wade Boggs and Roger Clemens and of course Babe Ruth and things like that. But I found, there, like you said, there were over 300, players who played for both teams, and so just kind of grew from that.
Now let me ask you this. Let's go back to the dead ball period, and.
Okay.
Let's go back to the dead ball period. I like the way that you break up the chapters because, like I mentioned in the beginning, you do give a brief overview of the history of the time periods, and of course the dead ball era. There was a friendly relationship. Now, a lot of people don't know that Colonel Jacob Ruppert and Harry Frazee were friends, but even before Frazee and Ruppert got to the Yankees. One might assume that this was going to be some hell of a rivalry because the first game they played, you tell me what happened.
The very first, it was basically a bench clearing brawl. I mean, so basically what happened was, the pitcher threw at the one of the hitters, and pretty soon they cleared benches, and the first brouhaha between the Yankees and the Red Sox was underway.
And it's amazing, and I did fact check it. I keep forgetting that the Red Sox really wasn't the Red Sox until the mid-teens, and the Yankees weren't the Yankees until 1912-13. They were called the Highlanders, and I think the Red Sox were called the Americans. But Boston at that time, pretty much, along with the Philadelphia Athletics and possibly the Tigers, were the strong arms of the American leagues. Now, you have Boston winning these championships in the mid-teens, and the Yankees, when Rupert came on, now beginning to grow a contender. What trades were made prior to the Babe that helped the Yankees and saw the Red Sox not getting the good end of the stick?
Well, it was interesting because up until like you said in the very beginning of the 20th century, Boston was the dominant team. Like they were the Yankees of the early 1900s. I mean, they won 5 World Series, all in a row, and the Yankees had not won a World Series up until then. But what started to happen was, for whatever reason, Boston became like a minor league club to the Yankees, where they kept taking all their really good players and trading them away to the Yankees, and then the Yankees would give them people in return, but there was never as good a return. I mean, Boston was not trading for value. Boston was trading to get rid of payroll or to get rid of players, and so the Boston kind of lost its way there after their last World Series win during the dead ball era, and because the dead ball eras were like the Red Sox were really, really good. I mean, they had Babe Ruth was pitching for them, and was quite the pitcher for them, and they had great team. And it wasn't until 1923 that the Yankees, after the dead ball era, that the Yankees won their first World Series.
Now let me ask you this: we got Holland. Now this is really interesting, and it blows my mind. Jack Chesbrough. Okay, let's talk about it.
Okay.
Why would the Red Sox, he played, I think, 1 game for the Red Sox.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
What the heck happened? What did the Sox see in him, and what happened that he only played the 1 game?
Yeah, I think it was a matter of they weren't actually trying to get Jack Chesbrough. They were trying to, get rid of, another player. And so, Jack Chesbrough was who was thrown in for the deal. But they were definitely not trading for value, because he had definitely had his peak years with the Yankees. He won 128 games for the Yankees. So he had his highlight there, and then by the time he even got there, he was 35, and we all know how good 35-year-old pitchers usually are. So by that time he was way past his prime, but in return, for Chesbrough, let's see who they got. I can't recall right now who they got, but basically, they traded. The Yankees got the advantage in that they traded well for that, and Boston got rid of some payroll.
Yeah, and another interesting trade here, before the curse of the Bambino, was Patsy Dowry. What was going on with Patsy over here?
Yeah, well, again, he spent some time with the back then they were like you said, they were Americans and the Highlanders, and he only spent equal amount of seasons. It was interesting, 3 seasons with the Yankees and 3 seasons, the Highlanders at the time, and 3 seasons with the Americans. But what tended to happen was he, kind of hit his stride by the time they traded him over. And so as a result, he was an all-star when he was with the Boston team. And, when he came over to the Yankees, he played really well the first 2 seasons. But he was not who they thought they were getting. So, I mean, they thought they were getting a perennial, back then 4 home runs led the league, or, wasn't, a ton of home runs. So there was not because that's why it was called the dead ball era. And, in this case, he came over and was not the offensive player that they were hoping they were going to get.
And it's interesting. I don't know how much research you did on the dead ball era and all this other stuff, but during the war, World War One,
Mm-hmm.
they had to use a cheaper material inside the ball, and when
Mm-hmm.
the dead ball era, ended pretty much with the Black Sox scandal. Of course, it ushered in live ball. I think Ruth hit 59 home runs in 1920,
Yep.
something like that. That no one ever saw those. In your research, did you see anything different that they put into the ball?
I didn't really get into that. What again? Part of the history that was fascinating, is that I think when the owners saw Babe Ruth starting to hit so many home runs, and they saw that people, like this, and they saw that what would it do for the gate, and so they were like, we need more home runs, and so I think it was a business decision for them to get rid of the dead ball and have a more lively ball, because even nowadays people want more offense, they want home runs, they want to see those. There's a really fascinating story about Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb was, one of the greatest hitters of all time. He was not a home run hitter. But when Babe Ruth became really popular and he was hitting all these home runs, Ty Cobb was like, well, I can do that if I wanted to. And he got up and in one game, he hit 3 home runs. And then he said, I'm done. I'm not going to hit anymore. He just wanted to show people he could do it if he wanted to. But for him, it was more fascinating. For him, it was more of a challenge to hit doubles and triples and whatnot. So it was a business decision. I think that owners saw that they could make more money with home runs rather than pitching. Because when baseball first started out way long time ago, the whole point of pitching was just to put the ball into play and not to strike people out, and but it was just to get the play started. And so pitching then evolved into what it was, and then we had the same evolution of hitting after the dead ball era when they saw what Ruth could do.
And you make an interesting point. And the point is this, that Ty Cobb, said after 1920, he didn't see any difference in the ball. All he saw was the way you hold the bat. And,
Yeah, because he had that split hand grip on
right.
his bat, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he said it was he swears, him and Chris Speaker swear that the ball was the same. Others, they said it was different. And I'll tell you one way it was different. Many people don't know. The reason why it's called dead ball is because they use pretty much 1 or 2 balls throughout a whole game. So if you hit a foul ball, I throw it back in. There's no souvenirs. Okay, and the ball, the ball starts out white. Beautiful pearly white. By the second inning, it's looking like a ragged, doll that's been kept around the house for years. And by the time the 9th inning comes around, it looks a little like a head of cabbage with the leaves falling off of it.
Sure. Well, I know that it was also a danger factor in that when you had these the scuffed up balls, the players couldn't see them and they would get beamed a lot more. And so one reason why they started introducing more balls into play is because for safety reasons.
And that ushers in the Carl Mays story, because I'll let you tell it about Ray Chapman. Then we'll discuss the whole feud that took place with Harry Frazee and Van Johnson over Mays, and how did he fare going from dead ball to live ball?
So, the Carl Mays was, he's the only pitcher in history to have killed someone with a beanball. So, he hit Ray Chapman in August 16th of 1920, and Chapman didn't die. It wasn't immediately, but, they didn't have the concussion protocol that they have nowadays. And so 12 hours later, he died. And that was a big wake-up call to baseball that, they needed to put more safety precautions into play. And so, and Carl Mays was, it's interesting because when he did that in 1920, he had played for the Red Sox for, a few years and then was over to the Yankees. So he was, switching in the rivalry, ended up killing, this player.
Carl Mays was, I don't know how much research you did, but I did it talking about Van Johnson, the president of the American League, and, Frazee, Carl Mays refused to play for the Red Sox by the end of 1919 season, he had an argument with management, and it was a whole big thing where he refused to play. I think they canceled his contract, if I'm not mistaken, and the Yankees picked him up. And Frazee appealed to Van Johnson, who pretty much didn't do anything about it, but squabble. And they have this whole thing where the American League is getting on Van Johnson, saying, well, this committee that runs baseball really isn't effective. And then what overshadowed that was the whole Black Sox scandal. So combined with certain things, the need for a commissioner came in. And Carl Mays, he was known as a headhunter. Way before Chapman. And that, I think, provoked the fact that, it was a little dubious how Chapman died. But again, the reason why the dead ball was so dangerous was you didn't have lights in the stadium at night.
Yeah.
So when when dusk fell, you're playing with a ball you can't see. That can go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately went into Chapman's head. Unfortunately, for that, after that they said the ball got to be white, and to this day we don't know if it was ever made differently. However, we now come to the big one, Babe Ruth. I'm going to let you tell the story because this can take an hour.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's funny because a lot of Babe Ruth history has become myth. Pointing to the stands, calling a shot, some people spell whether that was actually true or not. And so the common myth is that Harry Frazee was trying to find funding for a play called No No Nanette. And so in order to because he was really he was a big producer on Broadway. And so he wanted to, find a way to fund this play. And so, in order to do that, Babe Ruth had kind of, he had played for, several years for Boston, but, he was kind of a problem child. I mean, he was a drunkard. He was, he didn't want to pitch anymore. He didn't like pitching. So he was kind of become a problem child. So, I think, it was a combination of, he did have some money problems. It was not for the No No Nanette, as we come to have known. But basically, he sold Ruth to the Yankees for $125,000, which back then was, it's under league minimum now, but back then was really big. But in addition, the Yankees gave him a loan of $300,000, so it was almost a $500,000 deal for Frazee, and he could use that to to make sure that he could continue his being a producer. But I think, it was one of those things where it was inevitable that the Babe was going to be traded away to someplace because he was not happy in Boston.
Let me ask you this about, because everyone to this day, says, oh, that was the biggest mistake. I don't think it was the biggest mistake when you do the research.
No,
what do you think about it?
It was the start of the biggest mistake, which is that when Frazee saw how much money he could get for Ruth, he started trading away anytime like I was saying, like the Red Sox were kind of the minor league system of the Yankees, because every time they developed a player and he became pretty good, they would trade him away to the Yankees. Because they knew that it was like almost like a pipeline. I mean, there was a ton of trades that took place during that time, when Babe Ruth was traded. And actually I analyzed that in the book, where I look at, all the trades that took place. So I believe there was, from 1918 to 1925, they had, a ton of trades. So, that they traded away Babe Ruth, Duffy Lewis, Carl Mays, Wade Hoyt, Wally Shang, Joe Dugan, Everett Scott, Herb Pennock. I mean, Herb Pennock alone was, a big trade. So it kind of just was the beginning of this big mistake that the Boston was making, and that it wasn't focusing on winning so much as it was on saving money. And so, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Absolutely.
So And and eventually, and that the rivalry didn't really come back until the rivalry kind of went away for a while because the Yankees were just beating up on the Red Sox right and left, and the Red Sox didn't finish in the in the top of the division. And when I also looked in the book at the 1927 Yankees, which are the murderers row, and how they compare to the 1927 Red Sox, and it was quite fascinating, the difference between those two teams. But it wasn't until, even when Ted Williams played for the Red Sox, the rivalry was not as great as it has become in the last few decades. I think where the rivalry really became like what it is today is, back when in 1978 when the Yankees came back on the Red Sox and beat, with Bucky Dent's home, soul-crushing home run for the Red Sox. I mean, I think that was when it really started to hit its stride for a rivalry.
And what's interesting here, we'll get to Bucky Dent a little later. You mentioned Frazee needed the money. A lot of people don't know about the dead ball. A lot of people don't understand that during the dead ball era, from 1913 to 1915, there was an outlaw league called the Federal League. I'm not sure if you do a lot of research on that.
Yep. I didn't do a ton of research, but I'm familiar with that, yeah.
But they were spending a lot of money to take good players away from the Major League Baseball. Of course, they didn't stay, they lost on the profits and stuff like that, which is why the league folded, and they ended up going to court against Major League Baseball, and of course they lost. Landis was the first one in the lower courts to rule against the Federal League. Why he did is still a mystery, because he loved stuff like this, but I think he was just so ground hard that baseball should just remain the same and no one should interrupt it. He saw the Federal League as the enemy. The Supreme Court affirmed it in 1922. Whereby, it's still good law today with regard to antitrust not applying to baseball. But again, they have to spend more money, the magnates. And folks like Connie Mack in Philadelphia dumped their players because they were demanding high salary. Another one was the Sox. I mean, they got rid of Trispica when he was going to hold out. He was offered like twice amount to go to the Federal League. And they said, you'll be blacklisted if you do. And so he wasn't going to come back, and they got rid of him, traded him to Cleveland. I mean, all these different players, Home Run Baker, they all left because of it. And then when you come back, and you're still the only game in town, the monopoly occurs. And the monopoly contributed, as you well know, doing your research on the Black Sox, heavily for stuff like gambling to go on to make some extra money, finishing in third to make some extra money. Kaminsky, they were called the Black Sox, not only because they had a black mark on them, but because Kaminsky was too cheap to pay for laundry. That they were dirty. That's the type of era you're playing in. And what you said was, $300,000 a loan and $150,000. Well, that buys a hell of a lot more players. And I want people to realize that the trade of Babe Ruth did not go in vain to the Red Sox. I just think it was mismanaged of the players that they should have gotten after that. And yes, it fell off. And it fell off well into the 1940s. But here we have a new era, a new dawn. DiMaggio comes in 1936 with the Yankees. Ted Williams starts his career in 1939. 1941's the pinpoint of all this, the pinnacle. One hits 406. One has a 56-game hitting streak. Let's explain a little bit about this. What's going on?
So, well, the season where Joe DiMaggio got the MVP when he had his hit streak. If you look at Ted Williams' season, he was the MVP, and a lot of people felt like he very much got robbed, and DiMaggio got it because of the hype of the streak. But when you look at the numbers, Ted Williams was definitely the most valuable player that year. But interestingly enough, the owners of the Yankees and the owners of the Red Sox got together at a bar, and they decided, in principle, on word, to trade Joe DiMaggio to the to the Red Sox, and Ted Williams to the Yankees. And they had agreed on it. They shook on it. And then they parted ways at the end of the night. And then the Red Sox owner, because they were always trying to get more, and so they were like, because Joe DiMaggio was kind of in the end of his career. He wasn't as strong a player as Ted Williams was at that time, and so they wanted to get a little more value for Ted Williams, and so he said, hey, if you throw in this innocuous player, someone who is not doing well for you, whatever, let's make that trade. And of course, that player was Yogi Berra, and which leads one to believe, if that trade had occurred and Yogi Berra hadn't played for the Yankees, had ended up with the Red Sox, would the Yankees have won those 10 World Series that they won with Yogi Berra? But when I started to look into the projections of what it would have looked like had Ted Williams played for the Yankees full time and had Joe DiMaggio played for the Red Sox, it was really interesting because basically, Ted Williams was a left-handed hitter, and there's that short porch in Yankee Stadium, and Joe DiMaggio was a right-handed hitter, and there's the Green Monster that he could hit doubles and triples off all day long, and not only that, but a lot of people forget Dom DiMaggio, who was quite a good player for the Red Sox for many, many, many years, and so Joe would have been united with his brother, and who knows if he would have played better because he's playing with his brother, and but I always thought it was interesting also that the DiMaggio brothers were like part of on opposite sides of the rivalry, but they got along really well, so I don't think that was an issue.
I think all three brothers DiMaggios were in the major leagues. They all came up in the California leagues, the West Coast, Pacific Coast leagues, and Dom and Vinny, I think is Vinny DiMaggio and Jonah. They were all bred. And, they came from a strict Italian family whereby, they didn't believe in baseball making a living. They believed in working in a factory all day, 9 to 5. And all three of them were scorned by the father until they realized, hey, maybe you can make a living. But let me ask you something. You mentioned in the book a very interesting thing. Both of these the home team, the ballparks, actually hurt the hitters.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, when you look at statistics, DiMaggio had, I think, 361 home runs but as a Yankee, but a majority of those were on the road. So, and same thing with Ted Williams. I mean, Ted Williams had a career 521 home runs, but 273 of those were on the road. So they tended to be better away from their home stadiums. And so that's why it's fascinating to look at, if the trade had happened, how their home stadiums would have worked to their advantage, in that they would have, had the benefit of the short porch in Yankee Stadium and the Green Monster in Boston. So one wonders what would have happened to their already phenomenal numbers, especially Ted Williams. Like you said, Ted Williams never got his World Series ring. He definitely, he probably would have had he been traded, because the Yankee teams were pretty good during that time.
And I'll even say something more about Teddy Williams, because I think he should have won the MVP in 1941. He should have won it later in the 1950s. He was robbed in 1946. I think he should have won. He was robbed many times, only because I think he played on the Red Sox.
Well, and also he was not the most media friendly person, and those are the people who vote on the MVP. And so he basically thumbed his nose at the media in Boston, and years and years of proof of, like, if you do that to Boston, you'll end up, it's not a good thing, because they'll, the media will turn on you. And so I think he just was, he didn't get along with if he had gotten along with the writers, I think he would have won a couple more MVPs for certain.
Now, I just got done with a book. This is very interesting because you bring up a point which just crossed my mind. I forgot who the author was, but it's about Eddie Lopat, Vic Rashi, and, of course, the chief himself, on the Yankees. And those 5 dynasty teams, they were not these great Yankee teams you think they would have. DiMaggio retired in 51. You know, you got Mantle hurt. You have these 3 aging pitchers that are just barely holding their bodies together. And what, Stengel did was implement. Now, let me ask you this. I think Ted Williams got injured in 1950. I think right after the All-Star game. And then in 51, 52, and 53, he went to Korea. My thing is, if the Yankees got Ted Williams, late 40s, would they have won 5 in a row? Because they would have had Williams. Would they have built the team that they would have had?
Well, that is interesting because, like you said, those teams didn't have the perennial all-stars that, teams in the past would have, but they were a complete team. I mean, everyone knew like Yogi Berra played left field for them for a couple of those World Series. I can't imagine someone like Yogi Berra playing left field, but like they were getting guys in and the guys were playing their roles and they were playing as a team. It's kind of like, the Yankees of, the late 1990s where, there was Derek Jeter, but you had a lot of role players. Tino Martinez, you had, Scott Brocious, you had, just basically, guys who knew their role and did their roles very, very well. And so they functioned very well as a team. And that's why Ted Williams, I think, had trouble winning a World Series is that he was definitely the best hitter and best player in baseball, but he needed supporting cast in order to do better than he did.
And you know something? You make a good point. He will always say, well, he's dead now, but he always said, I was not the best player in baseball. The best player he ever saw, he gave the credit to, when he played, was Joe DiMaggio. He said, I was the best hitter in baseball ever, and bar none. And I speak to Jimmy Driscoll, who was a former player, he was fortunate enough to play under, Teddy Ballgame in 1972 when he coached the Tigers.
The Senators? Okay.
Well, the Senators became the Tigers that year. They moved from Washington. Yeah. And so Jimmy was on it, and he said he still, after all these years, hated pitches. He didn't even touch his pitches. He had the pitching coaches deal with him, and he dealt with the hitting. And maybe that's why he wasn't such a great manager in the fact that he hated pitching and pitchers. Here's another interesting thing. Talk about Joe McCarthy. You're going from a Yankee dynasty, 30s, and now you're going to the enemy. What's going on with this?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I'm going to go back for a point. I think Ted Williams, one of his more famous quotes is that the only thing dumber than one pitcher was 2 pitchers. So, he definitely was not a fan of the pitcher, that's for certain. And, he was a consummate hitter, but, he was not known as an outfielder, for his defensive prowess either. But, what's interesting about Joe DiMaggio, too, is that, I think Joe DiMaggio's star has become tarnished in the because history rewrites itself all the time. And some of the biographies I've been reading or some of the baseball books I've been reading lately have been very anti-Joe DiMaggio, because of it. He was known to be kind of cheap and he was known not to be a nice guy. And, he didn't even make it into the Hall of Fame on the first ballot. So, it's really interesting as people look back on, when they kind of relook at history that Joe DiMaggio is not coming off as well as he, during his heyday.
With Joe, it's amazing after he died, the amount of testimony and archival history that has been written about him. And he wasn't as nice a guy. And he was a womanizer, even though he was married. His marriage to Marilyn Monroe was only 9 months. I mean, he orchestrated her funeral when she died and sent roses to her grave as long as he lived every day. But DiMaggio was very insecure, never wanted us to shed a limelight with anyone but him. He was this cocky in his 3rd year as a Yankee, saying to management, I'm going to sit the season out. You're not paying me enough. You know, he wanted, I don't know, $30,000, $40,000 a year. And they're like, well, we don't even pay Lou Gehrig that. He's like, well, he's underpaid. What can I tell you?
Yeah.
And, you know, what can I tell you? DiMaggio was a severe womanizer. Whenever he went anywhere or did anything, he had to be polished before cameras rolled on him. His hair had to be perfect. And when he was always introduced at Yankee Stadium, he had to have it choreographed, saying that greatest ball player that has ever lived. He would only take the field for that. Now, of course, we all have flaws, you know. Unfortunately for DiMaggio, you know, he wasn't as mean as people think he was. I think he was indifferent. I think he was an introvert. Like when Mantle came up, he writes, and he, you know, gave testimony to say, you know, DiMaggio was just a basket case at the time because he was losing his abilities. You know, the injuries finally came, and he would be off in a corner. But he invited Mantle over to the table as a rookie, and he actually gave Mantle some pointers. But you're talking about Joe DiMaggio here, who, you know, they wrote a song about him, Joltin' Joe DiMaggio.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's right.
And, you know, he ends up suing, you know, Simon and Garfunkel 26 years later in 1968, Where Have You Gone, Joe DiMaggio, for Mrs. Robinson. He was that important. He was a national icon. And he was discriminated against. He was Italian. They called him the Big Dago, and they called Phil Rizzuto the Little Dago. But DiMaggio had an aura of himself that was not as destructive as Babe Ruth was. Babe Ruth, he was like a little kid, just like the little kid.
Was.
He was, even in his 20s, 30s,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
40s. You know, he didn't care, but DiMaggio cared about image, you know.
Yeah.
He had an agreement with the press when to do things, and unfortunately, in this world we live in today, that's not seen as the correct way. But back then, it was. I mean, the President of the United States, you know, had an agreement with the writers and photographers. Don't photograph me from the waist down. I'm a cripple.
Yep.
And they honored it.
Yep. And they left Kennedy alone. They left Kennedy alone when he was, you know, having all his affairs. They didn't report on that. I can imagine that now. So, yeah.
Right. You know, I mean, when you think about it, when Gary, I don't know if you're old enough to remember Gary Hart in 1987, that drop out.
Oh, yeah, I do remember.
Because of Donna Rice. Now, look, we got a president here who's participated in orgies and had 3 wives, and there's a known womanizer, and you could see he becomes president. Bill Clinton, he remained president. Everyone has an affair today. But, you know, it's not going to hurt you. But now we turn to the 60s and 70s. And you know who I speak to almost every week? Fritz Peterson. And Fritz Peterson was on the Yankees, from 1966 to 1974. And, of course, that's when the rivalry started getting heated up between the Sox and the Yankees. And, you know, when you speak to Fritz, he was the guy that traded wives and lives with his teammate Mike Kekich. And but he always said it was a huge mistake to give up Ellie Howard. Let's talk about Ellie Howard.
Yeah, you know, he was one of the, I mean, there were lots of fascinating people. He was definitely, you know, when you think of Elston Howard, you think of the Yankees as the first thing that pops into your mind. And a lot of people know that he, you know, got traded over to Boston. He didn't want to go. I mean, he got traded there, and he, you know, didn't want to play for them, but you know, he had to, you know, and so, but he definitely did not play as well and as much heart as he had with the Yankees. So, you know, so it's interesting when those big names like Elston Howard and Wade Boggs and Roger Clemens, and you know, when they go over to the other team, you know, to see when a team they've become so synonymous with, it's always really interesting.
And, you know, also during that era, huge for the Yankees. And you know what? The Yankees ended up giving him the shaft anyway. Sparky Lyle.
Yes. Yeah, you talk about a guy who, like, you know, he pitched really well. It's funny, that was another one I was going to mention. So, you know, he pitched so well for the Red Sox, and then he went over to the Yankees, and you know, you're our closer, and then they bring in, another closer, and he just gets displaced, and he becomes a setup man basically. He becomes the Betances of the Yankees back then.
He wins the Cy Young Award in
Yeah.
1977.
Yep.
And Greg Nettles, who he hated the Red Sox, like you wouldn't believe. I mean, he sucker punched.
I'll bet.
Bill Lee, hurt his arm. Well, Lee says his arm was hurting before, but that's another story for another time.
Yeah.
You know, and when they read in the papers, they got Goose Gossage, the Yankees, and this is a year after he wins the Cy Young Award as a closer. You know, Greg Nettles says to Sparky, "Hey, going from Cy Young to Sayonara." And that was it for Sparky, man. You know, it astounds me because Sparky Lyle was so instrumental to the success of the Yankees during that time period when they were rebuilding, and to just get rid of it. Like, here's another one on the flip side. One of the best pitchers I've ever seen in my lifetime, Louis Tiant.
Yep. Yeah, and you know, there's a guy who was synonymous with playing with the Red Sox, but you know, just like any aging player, he wants to hold on to his playing career. So he went and played 1 year in 1960. He actually spent half the year. I wouldn't say half, but he played 30 games for the Red Sox in 1967, and then 22 for the Yankees. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. My fault. Tiant played in 78. He played from 71 to 78 with the Red Sox, and then went over to the Yankees, and was definitely not as good a pitcher. But I being a Cincinnati fan, I watched the 75 World Series and watched Louis Tiant pitch for the Red Sox, and he had that amazing eephus pitch of his that was just like, I remember when I was watching that, because I have that on DVD, and I was watching it, and I was like, did he just do what I think he did? And I had to rewind it 2 or 3 times to see that pitch, because you don't see anyone pitch like that nowadays. But yeah, he definitely was a very fiery player. He was kind of like I would compare him to like a David Ortiz, and he would get his team fired up. He was very supportive of his team, but he did spend a couple years with the Yankees.
And we get into this whole thing with the post-Bucky Dent. The 80s were, the Yankees had the best record in the 80s, and they always finished in second or third place. Red Sox, what were they? A couple of outs away, 1 out away from winning the World Series against the
against the Mets.
Yeah, I was there. I was in New York. I remember the whole place went berserk. When that happened, and but you do have a couple of players shifting. Of course, unfortunately, Don Baylor, who just died a few months ago, he played for both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and Don Baylor, it's interesting because, and I always associate him because of the way where I was growing up as being the Colorado Rockies, manager, and so it was interesting to see his. For me, when you research something like this and you look back at these, you see the players who are now managing. You see them when they were players, because you forget that they were players. Don Baylor spent I think 3 years with the Yankees, and he went over to the Red Sox. But neither team was like, you wouldn't say like it was his best team, or the team that he was synonymous with.
All I remember from Don Baylor, he just stand there and let it get plunked by the ball. That's
yeah. Took a lot of pitches.
Yeah, no matter what he was, he just. But here's a big one. Wade Boggs. Why the hell would you give up a 338 hitter? And
well, that was one of 2 mistakes that the Red Sox made around that, during that time. Was, when they got rid of Clemens. I mean, they let him go to free agency. You have this guy who is, one of the best pitchers in baseball, and you just let him go. But Wade Boggs was, he's synonymous with the Red Sox. I mean, you would think with him at the Red Sox. One thing I found really interesting is I took a tour of Fenway Park, and they have these tickets that you can buy where you actually get to watch the game with a Red Sox legend. Of course, they're very pricey. And they were talking about this elite group of guys who were kind of the guys, and they said we're only taking guys who played for the Red Sox their entire career. Those are the only guys that will do that. But then eventually, I think Wade Boggs does that now for the Red Sox. So he's kind of gone back to the Red Sox and, as his team. But, he played, he gave several good years to the Yankees.
He had his only 2 Golden Gloves with the Yankees.
Yeah,
that's
exactly. Which is interesting because it's towards the end of his career. And I don't know if you knew this, but Wade Boggs, when he went into the Hall of Fame, was actually going to go in he wanted to go in as a Tampa Bay Devil Ray.
Yeah, because that's his hometown.
Yeah, exactly. So, but they wouldn't let him because, he didn't play for them for very long. But I thought that was fascinating that he wasn't associated with either of them, at that time. He was, picking the Tampa Bay Rays, or Devil Rays at the time.
And you know what I remember about Boggs? I remember Boggs was a rookie. He was the last guy to strike out that gave Dave Righetti his no-hitter on July 4th, 1983. And that day I went wild. I remember, a huge hit, but I remember Boggs. He just ate up that ball. He didn't have to be a home run hitter. I think his highest total was 24 home runs he hit in the season. That guy can put the ball anywhere, all from his magic chicken dinners that he used to eat before the games and stuff. Hey, you have your superstitions, he has his.
That's right.
All right.
Well, it's interesting. What's interesting, you say he struck out. You remember him for the strikeout. He struck out very little. I mean, that was another thing.
Very little.
I've always been really impressed with pure hitters. Like Joey Votto is my all-time favorite player at this point because just a very pure hitter. And Wade Boggs was that way too. And so was, there have been many. Ted Williams was a pure hitter, and Tony Gwynn was a pure hitter. But I've always been amazed at people that don't strike out much, and that they have more walks than strikeouts. And every year that Wade Boggs played for both teams, he had more walks than he had strikeouts, which I think is just a phenomenal stat, especially in today's age of Mark Reynolds striking out 200 sometimes and Adam Dunn striking out 200 sometimes.
I think Yogi Berra, you can put in that category too. He didn't strike out very often, Yogi. Now let's get to Clemens, because I remember I was up here in Massachusetts when he tipped his cap to the Fenway favorites. He struck out 20 Detroit Tigers in his last game as a Red Sox. Why the hell do you let him walk to free agency and go to Toronto? Well, and not only that, he was the Cy Young both years, I think, with Toronto.
Yes, he did. Yeah, and it was really interesting because as a team, I understand as a team, it's a business, and you have to hedge your bets. You have to say, did we get the best years out of him? Because he played for them for over a decade, and so you got to figure, have we gotten the best out of him? The Reds made that mistake when they got rid of Frank Robinson. They thought Frank Robinson was done, and he went on, to Baltimore and won the MVP with them in the World Series. So I think Boston had to weigh it. Boston, if you look at their history, they've always been really good at not overpaying people that are towards the end of their career. Like Pedro Martinez, same thing. He, pitched for them for several years, and then when he got towards when they felt like he was not as good a pitcher as he was, they didn't offer him the contract, and he went to the Mets, and he pitched with them, and he wasn't as effective. So I think it's tough as a team. You have to you don't want to be like the Anaheim Angels right now, who are paying for Albert Pujols, who has the worst WAR in baseball currently, and they've got him for another several years at several, over $20 million a year, and they're stuck with him because they overpaid for an aging player. So I often look at that, and I thought the Red Sox made a mistake, but you look at what he got for going to Toronto. The Red Sox saved some money in that they didn't have to pay him the big dollars. I remember when he signed with the Yankees in 2007, he went back with them. He pitched for them for the second half of the year. He got paid more, for just playing half the year than he did, playing full years in Boston. So, you can, the one argument I make there is that I think that because it's really close as numbers, and he won more, he won World Series with the Yankees, but the Red Sox didn't have to pay as much for his services. And again, the Red Sox, to give you more examples, they let Johnny Damon walk. They let Jacoby Ellsbury walk. They very rarely hang on to people. And when they do, it's like David Ortiz, who the ageless wonder, who has a phenomenal year his final season in baseball.
And you just answered my question about Damon and Ellsbury. Obviously, the Yankees overpaid for Ellsbury, and he's not great. Damon, though, the Red Sox made more of it because they had to pay less for Damon. But again, Damon won 2 World Series with the Sox and 1 with the Yankees. So
yeah,
you go into the fact. Well, times are different now. It's no longer the 1970s or 80s or even the whole thing with A-Rod. That's my final question. What do you think the Red Sox would have done with A-Rod had they had gotten him?
Well, it's really interesting because, I love that kind of that what-if mentality. And, to give your listeners a very brief background, Alex Rodriguez was going to be traded to the Red Sox, and he was going to take less than his Texas contract allowed so that he could play with the Red Sox. But the baseball commission or the union would not let him take less money than the contract was. And so deal fell through. Aaron Boone blows out his knee playing basketball, and then next thing you know, A-Rod is a Yankee. If he had gone to the Red Sox, I don't think that the Red Sox win all their 3 World Series in the 21st century, because when you look at their team, they had a team. There was no huge superstar. They had role players. I'm sure they had Pedro Martinez, and they had but they had other people who just fit their roles perfectly. And I think A-Rod would have sucked a lot of their payroll and not enabled them to have gotten those role players. A-Rod has won one World Series with the Yankees, and that was the year they paid a ton. They Mark Teixeira, him, and they basically bought the World Series that year. But they've never been able to replicate that. When you look at A-Rod's time with the Yankees, he was a very good player. But even, with all the baggage that came with him, I definitely don't think that he was. I think the Red Sox really benefited from not getting him.
Let me ask you this, and again, what do you see the future of these ball clubs as rivalries? It's so different that Johnny Damon's here, and then he's with the Yankees, same with Ellsbury. You're moving all around nowadays. I don't think there's any team allegiances. Do you think that the rivalry has fallen off?
I don't, because I think that the reason why the rivalry will not fall off is because if the Yankees and Red Sox are ever playing each other, you can always find it televised somewhere on national television, because people like that rivalry and they're going to watch that. And so I think the media is going to perpetuate that rivalry, and they're going to keep that going. And so there was a hilarious ESPN commercial where David Ortiz was in a meeting, and Jorge Posada was in this meeting with some of the ESPN anchors, and they were making fun of Jorge's hat because it wasn't broken in. And he said, "I never wear the hat." And so David Ortiz was breaking in the hat, and he put the hat on his head when the Red Sox mascot walks by, and the Red Sox mascot's like, "No," and David Ortiz is like, "No, I'm not going with them." But I think that rivalry will always be there because they're in the same division. Even right now, they're in first and second place. So, they're in a division where they're going to finish first and second, more times than not. Toronto has tried to play that game with them, but has not been very successful with that. You always feel for the Rays because they're trying to cobble together their team as best they can. But I just think that the rivalry will be there because they're in that East Division, and they're going to be the two teams to reckon with nearly every year.
I have to agree. And, Baltimore, I think, had a good shot also. I think Baltimore's on the rise. They have a very powerful team. In fact, the Yankees have a doubleheader, I think, today with them. And, I'm watching. Again, I live in Red Sox Nation. And my kids, they don't even have, this is how bad it is up here, Todd. They don't even have a Yankees team in Little League Baseball.
Wow.
Hey, my son has played for the Tigers, the Detroit Tigers. He played for the Minnesota Twins. They even got a New York Mets team, and they beat them but the Yankees. Everyone always says, "Why are you Yankees?" And then when I tell them, like, "Oh, well, that's acceptable."
That's funny.
Lived there, but no one here. Now, let me ask you this question: is there anything that I forgot to ask, or maybe you want to tell the listeners at home that maybe something I overlooked?
No, I think we covered the gist of it. I think the one thing we didn't talk about at much length was when Bucky Dent hit his home run that year in general. I think that the Red Sox were ahead by 18 games, I believe, with like a month or so to go in the season, and so that in itself I thought was fascinating because when you look at the Yankees back then, they didn't get along at all. They hated one another. I mean, Reggie Jackson was on that team, and people couldn't stand him, and there was, all this dissension on the team. But it was amazing how they pulled together and were able to come back. And, even when they caught the Red Sox and passed them, and I think the Red Sox had to win 3 in a row to force the playoff game where Bucky Dent hit the home run. So that season itself is a very storied season and a very fascinating season, I think, between that rivalry and that it's not just the Bucky Dent game. It was the being so ahead by the Red Sox and being caught and then having to catch back up. And so I think that is a real fascinating aspect of the rivalry.
They wore Red Sox and Pinstripes. Wherever can we find this fascinating book, sir?
Well, you can, of course, Amazon has every book on the planet, but you can go to Amazon. McFarland is who the publisher is, so you can go to McFarland's website. But so either of those two places, Amazon probably is your best bet.
All right, well, I implore everyone to go and get this book. If you're a Yankees fan, if you're a Red Sox fan, if you're a baseball fan, just like the author here today, he's from, for God's sakes, Ohio. By the way, do you think the state's going to go far this year? I have no idea.
It will be interesting. It was interesting. When I was talking to someone before, they said, did I think the Red Sox and Yankees were the biggest rivalry in sports? And having lived in Ohio my whole life, I've been part of that Michigan-Ohio rivalry. And I would still say that the Red Sox and Yankees have a greater rivalry just because they play more games and there's just so much more to that rivalry, so much more of a storied history.
Let me just say something. Every third week in November, since 1991, now that I have kids that are 10 years old, whatever I'm doing on that Saturday, third week in November, I stop and I turn on the Michigan-Ohio State game, which is notoriously played right before Thanksgiving. And I don't care if Michigan was awful or Ohio State was awful or both are good. I sit and I watch it, and I'm just fascinated how big Ohio State Stadium is, and even more intrigued by what's going on up in Michigan, how big their stadium is. It holds over 100,000 people. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. And and of course that rivalry has kind of been, being a Ohio State fan, I can say is that in the last few years, Michigan hasn't lent much to the rivalry. I mean, Ohio State has been whomping them pretty regularly. So I'm sure that the tide will turn and it will go the other way sometime in the near future. But I know that Michigan has scrambled to get, the right coach in there, and maybe Harbaugh is that guy, but the right guy in there to be, because that's what, when you come in, I mean, Earl Bruce used to say, he was the OSU coach. He said, all the other games don't really matter. You have to beat Michigan. I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean, they're right next to each other geographically.
Oh, yeah.
But I hope you had a good time today, sir.
I did. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
This is going to go circulating. When it does, I made a deal with McFarland to send them a copy of all the books they send me, and one of them was yours. And so when the show comes out either a few days from now when my publisher does it, and you get a copy, I'll send you, and then I'll send one to McFarland, and then all my listeners will have a treat. Hang on to the line. I'm going to end the show. Don't hang up. Folks, as you see, we started this season off with a bang, one of my favorite topics. Go out, get this book. You won't be disappointed. I love the fact of the statistics that Mr. Stanley puts in his book. It is a fine read, cover to cover. In fact, if you don't want to buy it now, buy it for someone who loves baseball for Christmas. I'm sure that whoever reads this book is going to be enlightened on the most fabled rivalry in all of sports. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Todd, for being on the show. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.